The helicopters didn't ask for permission. Two Blackhawks tore through a wall of Georgia rain and dropped into the parking lot of Riverside Crest Medical Center like they owned it. Rotors screaming, landing lights cutting through the dark, water spraying in every direction. Armed men in tactical gear poured out before the wheels fully touched asphalt. They weren't paramedics. They weren't local. They moved like people who had rehearsed dying for a living. One of them was carrying a man who was already halfway gone, chest wound, tourniquet above the knee, face the color of old concrete. The lead operator hit the ER doors at a dead run and grabbed the first person he saw by the collar. Where's Phantom? If this story grabs you from the first second, subscribe to the channel, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go. The night had started quietly enough, which in the ER meant nothing good was coming, just the slow accumulation of bad luck waiting to tip over. Evelyn Brooks had been on shift for 9 hours. She'd triaged a construction worker with a broken wrist, monitored a 62-year-old woman through a hypertensive episode, restocked the crash carts on bays 3 and 5, and eaten half a granola bar standing next to the medication dispenser because there hadn't been time to sit. Her sneakers were waterlogged from a leaking ceiling tile near the ambulance bay, and the left one made a soft squelching sound every third step that she'd stopped noticing around hour 6. She was charting vitals at the central nursing station when Dr. Victor Sloan came in from the attending lounge, still buttoning his white coat, smelling faintly of coffee and something sharper underneath. Maybe bourbon, though nobody ever said it out loud. He was 47, tall, the kind of man who took up space deliberately and expected rooms to rearrange themselves around him. His record was genuinely impressive, and he made sure everyone in a 10-foot radius was aware of it at all times. He stopped behind Evelyn without announcing himself and looked at the chart she was completing. "You flagged the Marchetti patient for surgical consult?" "Yes." She didn't turn around. "His abdomen is rigid, BP has been dropping, and his pain response isn't consistent with the original presentation. I think." "You think." He said it the way someone might say you tried, with a thin, patient smile that meant neither patience nor kindness. That's ambitious, for a floor nurse. 2 other nurses at the station kept their eyes on their screens. Residents learned fast that getting between Sloan and whoever he'd decided to diminish on a given evening was a waste of social capital. Evelyn finished typing the note. "The numbers support it. The numbers support my assessment, which I've already documented." He reached past her and tapped 2 keystrokes, pulling up his own notation. "Musculoskeletal. He's a 40-year-old who moves furniture for a living. Refer him to ortho in the morning." He straightened. "And next time you want to second-guess attending physician judgment, maybe consider whether that's within your scope." She looked at him then, not with anger, with something quieter and somehow more pointed. "Of course, doctor." He walked away. The charge nurse, Dolores Vega, rolled her chair 2 inches sideways and said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, "You're probably right about Marchetti." "I know." Evelyn saved the chart and reached for the next one. "But I documented it. If his pressure drops another 10 points overnight, there's a paper trail." That was how she survived Victor Sloan. Not by fighting, by building walls out of documentation and waiting. She'd been at Riverside Crest for 3 years. In that time, she'd watched Sloan publicly embarrass 2 residents into requesting transfers, had a dietary aide reduced to tears over a meal cart timing error, and had once, memorably, referred to the entire overnight nursing staff as support personnel during a department meeting, as though they were furniture with stethoscopes. Administration tolerated him because his outcomes were good, and his reputation brought in referrals. His ego was treated as overhead, a cost of doing business. Evelyn had learned to move around him the way you move around a structural column in a building. Acknowledge it, account for it, never expect it to shift. She was reviewing lab values on a pediatric patient in Bay 7 when the sound came. Not through the walls, through the floor. A low rhythmic vibration that built fast, rattling the light fixtures, shaking the IV bags on their poles in small, trembling arcs. Several patients looked at the ceiling. A child started crying in triage. Then the parking lot lights went sideways. Evelyn walked to the window at the end of the corridor and looked out. 2 helicopters, military configuration, no civilian markings, running lights strobing in the rain. were settling onto the asphalt with complete indifference to the cars, the fire lane signage, and the general operating logic of a community hospital parking lot. Men in tactical gear were already moving before the landing skids hit the ground. She was already turning back toward the ER when the doors burst open. The man who came through first was built like someone had assembled him from spare parts designed for maximum intimidation. Wide through the shoulders, neck thick with old scar tissue, jaw set in the particular way of people who have been delivering bad news in high-pressure situations for so long, it no longer registers as stress. He had a unit patch on his left sleeve that Evelyn couldn't read from across the room. He didn't need to announce himself. His presence announced him. Behind him, 2 more operators carried a man on a portable litter, a real field litter, not a hospital stretcher. And the man on it was in serious trouble. Chest wound with a field dressing already soaked through, tourniquet on the right leg, airway compromised by the angle of his neck, face ashen. He was breathing, but barely, and in the wrong rhythm. Dolores was already on the radio. Trauma incoming, Bay 1, all hands. The lead operator, the one with the scar tissue on his neck, stopped at the center of the ER and looked at the room with the calm, measuring gaze of someone who was deciding within seconds whether this environment would help or kill his man. "We need a trauma team, now." He scanned the faces. "Where's Phantom?" Nobody moved. Dolores looked at the other nurses. One of the residents frowned. A unit clerk slowly put down the phone. "Sir, if you can give us the patient's name," Dolores started. "I don't need intake. I need Phantom." He looked at every face again quickly, reading them. "If that person is in this building, I need them in that room in 30 seconds. Victor Sloan had materialized from somewhere, likely the attending lounge, drawn by the noise, and now stood at the edge of the bay with the authority of a man who genuinely believed that rooms were his by right. He looked at the operators, looked at the patient, and his face arranged itself into something that managed to convey both concern and mild offense simultaneously. "I'm Dr. Victor Sloan, Chief Trauma Attending. Whatever this patient needs, we are prepared to—" "Where is Phantom?" Sloan blinked. "I don't know what that means." "It's a call sign." The operator didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Someone at this facility has that designation. We were told they were here." Sloan spread his hands. "I don't know who you're looking for, but I can assure you that the trauma team at this facility is more than capable." On the litter, the patient seized. It was fast. The legs stiffened, the back arched, the soaked field dressing shifted, and a fresh pulse of dark red appeared at the corner. One of the supporting operators moved to stabilize, but the angle was wrong and the litter began to tip. Evelyn was across the floor in 6 steps. She wasn't running, exactly. It was faster than walking and more controlled than running. The particular efficient velocity of someone who had moved toward emergencies so many times that the approach had been optimized out of conscious thought. She caught the litter edge with one hand and the patient's shoulder with the other, correcting the tilt, and in the same motion assessed the wound site, the airway, the pulse point at his throat. Her hands knew what they were doing before her brain had finished formulating the sentence. "He's got tension pneumo developing on the left side." She looked up at the operator. "How long ago was the chest wound?" The man stared at her. Something crossed his face. Not recognition yet, but the precursor to it. The moment when a pattern begins resolving into a face. 40 minutes? 38. "Any needle decompression in the field?" "Negative. We had no kit." "Okay." She was already moving, reaching for the supply cart. "We need to get him into Bay 1. I need a 14-gauge angio, chest tube setup, and someone needs to get a warmed saline bag on that leg before the tourniquet comes off." "Excuse me." Sloan's voice had gone several degrees colder. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this patient needs a physician, not— Then you should start examining him." She looked at Sloan with complete steadiness, because his trachea is deviating left and he's going to arrest in about 4 minutes. Sloan's eyes went to the patient. He couldn't help it, and in the half-second that his clinical brain overrode his ego, his expression changed. The deviation was there. Subtle, but there. "Bay 1, he said, and then, immediately, as though the concession had never happened. "And someone get me a consult on that chest. I want cardiothoracic on the phone." Evelyn was already inside the bay. What happened in the next 11 minutes was not clean. It was not elegant. The patient fought the airway management, The light kept flickering in the left corner of the room from a wiring issue. Maintenance had been notified about 4 times. And at one point, a second operator came through the door to tell the lead that the helicopters were being asked to move by hospital security, which seemed to genuinely perplex him. Evelyn moved through it without theatrics. She placed the needle decompression with the kind of muscle memory that doesn't come from nursing school. She coordinated the chest tube insertion with Dr. Rajesh Patel, a second-year surgery resident who was good and frightened and smart enough to follow clear direction, and kept the patient's pressure from bottoming out by making 2 calls that Sloan later claimed he had been about to make himself. The tourniquet was released with controlled timing. The airway was secured. At minute 11, the patient's oxygen saturation climbed from 74 to 91. At minute 14, he was stable. Not fine, but stable. Sloan, who had been hovering at the edge of the bay with the posture of a man who had not decided yet whether to intervene or take credit, looked at the monitors and then at Evelyn with an expression she recognized. She'd seen it before, but not gratitude exactly, but the moment when someone realizes the math doesn't add up in their favor and starts searching for a reframe. He found one quickly. "Someone briefed me on what was administered and when," he said, addressing Patel and pointedly not Evelyn. "And Brooks, this was a team effort, good instincts on the initial assessment." He said it the way you throw a coin into a fountain, a gesture with no weight behind it. "But from here, this is a physician-managed case. I'll need you back on the floor." Evelyn stripped her gloves. Of course. She was turning toward the supply disposal when the lead operator stepped directly into the doorway. He wasn't blocking her. He was just standing there, looking at her face in the overhead light of the trauma bay, with the focused attention of someone comparing a photograph to a person in front of them. His voice, when he spoke, had lost its operational flatness entirely. "Your left forearm," he said. "Let me see your left forearm." The room went quiet. Not silent. Monitors beeped, IV pumps ticked, rain hit the window in sheets. But the human voices stopped. Evelyn looked at him. She could have said no. She could have walked out. She'd had 3 years of practice walking out of rooms where things were being decided about her. Instead, she pushed the sleeve of her scrub top up past the elbow. The tattoo was old, faded the way military ink fades, not blurred but softened, like something that had been carried for a long time. A single line of coordinates above a small geometric sigil that had specific meaning to a specific unit in a specific conflict theater and meant nothing to anyone who hadn't been there. The operator looked at it for 2 full seconds. Then he said, in a voice that had something breaking in it, "Phantom, you're alive." It wasn't a question. Sloan laughed, a short, reflexive sound of dismissal. "I'm sorry, but what is happening right now? This is one of my floor nurses. She's been here 3 years. I don't know what you think." "Stand down, doctor." The operator didn't look at him. He was still looking at Evelyn. "You don't know who you've been working next to." "I know exactly who I've been working." I said, "Stand down." The second operator, who had come in from the door, put a hand on the wall beside Sloan. Not threatening, but definitive, like a fence post going into the ground. Sloan stopped talking. The lead operator, his name tape said Carver, Evelyn could see it now, crossed the bay in 3 steps and stopped in front of her. Up close, she could see the exhaustion in his face, the kind that lives in the eyes and doesn't leave after sleep. She recognized it. She'd worn it herself. "We thought you were dead," he said quietly. "After the Fong extraction, they told us you didn't make it out." "I made it out." "How long have you been here?" 3 years. He absorbed that. "Living as a nurse." "Working as a nurse?" The correction was gentle, but it was a correction. "I had reasons." He nodded slowly. "I know you did." He looked around the room, at Patel, who had gone very still, at the 2 other operators standing at the door, at Sloan, who was composing himself with the energy of a man writing a strongly worded internal memo. "We're going to have a conversation about those reasons, but right now," he turned to look at the stabilized patient on the table. "Right now you just saved Sergeant Dolan's life, and there are 3 more inbound." The words landed. Evelyn looked at him. 3 more. Secondary helo. ETA 9 minutes. RPG strike on a vehicle convoy during an extraction gone wrong. We've got a GSW abdominal, a crush injury bilateral legs, a blast TBI, and a suspected splenic lac. He held her gaze. We didn't know you were here, but we know it now. And I'm asking. She looked at the room. At Patel, who was watching her. At Dolores in the doorway, who had been there long enough to have heard everything and whose face was very carefully neutral. At Sloan, who was about to open his mouth. Get me the trauma attending roster for the night, she said. Not to Sloan, to Dolores. And call respiratory. Get 2 vents to bay 2 and 3. We need to reconfigure the OR corridor if we're using it as overflow. She looked at Carver. Your medics? Are any of them trained in surgical assist? 2 of them, yes. Then they're with me. She looked at Patel. You're on the abdominal case. I'll walk you through it if you need me to, but your hands are good. Don't second-guess yourself tonight. Patel nodded. Nobody asked you to reorganize my ER. Sloane's voice was controlled, but stripped of its usual pleasantness entirely. You are a staff nurse. You work under supervision. You do not direct attending physicians, and you do not assign surgical cases. And if you take one more step toward that phone, I will have you removed from this building. He looked at Carver. Whatever you think you know about this woman, she is not qualified to run trauma operations. I am. And if you interfere with hospital operations again, I will be calling hospital security and legal counsel. Carver looked at him for a long moment. Doctor, he said, with respect, and I'm giving you considerably more than you've earned tonight. The woman standing next to you is the reason Sergeant Dolan is still breathing. She performed a field-level tension pneumothorax decompression in conditions that would have rattled most trauma surgeons, and she did it faster and more accurately than anyone I've seen do it outside a combat theater. He glanced at Evelyn. She's not here because she's unqualified. She's here because she chose to be here, and that's a distinction that matters. Sloane's jaw tightened. And the 3 inbound patients, Carver continued, are active-duty United States Special Operations personnel, so you should think carefully about what you're about to say next. The lights flickered. Outside, through the window, the parking lot strobed white under lightning. And then the second helicopter came in low over the tree line, searchlight cutting through the storm, and the noise of it hit the building like a physical thing. Windows rattling, ceiling tiles trembling, the persistent beeping of the monitors briefly swallowed by the roar. Evelyn was already moving toward the door. She pulled on a fresh pair of gloves as she walked, and she did not look back at Victor Sloan, and she did not hesitate, and she did not explain herself further. The doors opened in front of her, and the rain came in sideways, and the next helicopter was settling onto the lot, and the doors on its side were already sliding open before the rotors had finished slowing, and there were people inside it who were badly hurt, and had minutes, not hours. And somewhere in the back of her mind, in the place where she'd stored 3 years of being called just a floor nurse and support personnel, and you think, the thing that lived there, patient, quiet, absolutely certain of its own existence, finally moved. She stepped through the doors into the rain. The rain hit her face like cold gravel, and she didn't flinch. The second helicopter had touched down at an angle, pilot compensating for a crosswind that was picking up fast, tail rotor swinging wide before correcting. And the doors were already open, one of the operators hanging half out with his hand pressed flat against the chest of the man beside him, keeping pressure on something that needed pressure kept on it. Evelyn reached the landing zone in 9 seconds. She could feel rather than hear the footsteps behind her, Carver, 2 of his men, and Patel, who had grabbed a trauma bag from the bay without being told. The first patient off the helicopter was the abdominal GSW. She knew it before she saw the wound because of how he was holding his body. That particular rigid stillness of someone whose core had been compromised and who had learned in the last hour that movement cost too much. I was conscious, which was both good and complicated. His name tape said Okafor. He looked at her when she reached him and his eyes were tracking, which meant brain perfusion was still adequate, which meant they had time, but not a lot of it. Okafor, I've got you. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, pulse fast, thready, but present. Where's the entry point? Left flank. His voice was barely there. Went through. There's an exit. Through was sometimes better, sometimes wasn't. Any abdominal rigidity on the right side? He made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She took it as yes. Okay. Don't try to talk. She looked at Patel. This one's yours. Through and through left flank, probable right side spillage. Get him to Bay 2 and do not let anyone stall you on imaging. Go straight to manual assessment. You don't have the time for CT. Patel nodded and moved. The second patient was the crush injury. Both legs, the operator had said in the bay, and that was accurate but incomplete in the way field reports often were. What he had was bilateral lower extremity trauma, with compartment syndrome developing in the left leg, fast enough that the skin over the calf was already taut and shiny in a way that meant the clock was not their friend. He was unconscious, young. She put him at maybe 22, 23, the kind of young that felt obscene in a trauma bay. She directed him to Bay 3 and flagged the leg issue for the orthopedic resident on call, who was going to need to wake up and move. The third patient was the blast TBI, and he was the one she was most worried about. He was ambulatory, which was the first problem. He was walking toward the ER doors on his own power with the jerky, slightly too certain gait of someone whose vestibular system had been scrambled and whose brain was compensating with false confidence. He'd refused a litter. One of the operators was shadowing him close, not quite touching, in the posture of someone who'd been told twice not to grab him, but wasn't going to let him fall. "Hey." She stepped directly into his path. Not aggressive, just present, solid. "I need you to stop walking." He looked at her. His pupils were unequal, left larger than right by a margin that made the back of her neck prickle. "I'm fine," he said, and his voice was too loud in the particular way of people who couldn't accurately gauge their own volume because the fluid balance in their inner ear was completely disrupted. "You walked into a door frame getting off the helicopter," the operator behind him said. "Twice." The door frame moved. "I need you to sit down for me," Evelyn said. She kept her voice level and close. "Not because you can't handle it, because I need to look at something, and I can't do that while you're moving." He looked at her for a beat. The particular assessing look of someone in the military deciding whether the person giving them direction has actually earned the right to give it. Then he sat down on the wet asphalt, just like that, cross-legged, like he'd decided. "Anisocoric pupils, left larger," she said to the operator. "What's his name?" "Trevino. Do you have a headache?" "Yeah." "When did it start?" "After the thing." "The explosion." "Yeah, the thing." He blinked slowly. "There's two of you." "That's expected right now." She was already flagging a gurney coming from inside. "We're going to get you inside and get a look at your head. You're not going to die tonight." "I know," he said, with a strange, distant certainty. "I've got stuff to do next week." She almost smiled. "Good. Hold on to that." They got him inside. The ER was unrecognizable from what it had been 40 minutes earlier. The controlled routine of a nighttime hospital shift had been replaced by something that hummed at a different frequency entirely, louder, faster, with the specific quality of controlled chaos that either tips into catastrophe or finds its own brutal order, depending entirely on who's managing it. Dolores had cleared the non-critical cases to the waiting area and opened the supply corridor as secondary overflow. Someone had turned up the overhead lighting in bays 1 through 3 so that the rooms had the flat, shadowless brightness of an operating theater. Monitors beeped at triple the usual density. IV poles had been clustered in the corridor like a steel forest. Evelyn moved through it, and things organized themselves in her wake. Not because she was issuing commands, she wasn't, not in any showy way, but because the staff who'd worked with her for 3 years had a well-worn understanding that when Evelyn Brooks moved with that particular velocity, the correct response was to get aligned or get out of the way. She coordinated Trevino's neuro workup, verified that the orthopedic resident, a third-year named Morales, who had good hands and a tendency to over-rely on imaging, understood that the compartment syndrome was a clinical diagnosis and not a waiting for a scan diagnosis. She checked Sergeant Dolan's vitals in Bay 1, found them holding, adjusted his oxygen flow, and noted that someone had failed to label the secondary IV line, which she labeled herself without comment and without making it anyone's problem. What she did not do was go into Bay 2 where Patel was working on Okafor. Not because she didn't want to, because she knew Patel well enough to know that a second set of hands would be more useful than a supervisory presence, and she'd already told him what he needed to know. She was at the central station updating the tracking board when Sloan found her. He'd been somewhere during the intake. She'd been aware of him at the edges, doing the thing powerful people do when the situation has outgrown them, which is to move with great authority in the direction of things that have already been handled. He'd taken a phone call. He'd He'd spoken to the charge nurse in tones that implied he was directing something. She didn't know what. She hadn't asked. Now he stood next to her at the station with his arms crossed and his voice low. "This needs to stop," he said. She kept typing. "You are operating outside your scope. You directed a surgical resident on case management without authorization from an attending. You made treatment decisions on patients who are not assigned to you. You gave orders to my nursing staff." He paused. "Whatever history you have with these military people, and I don't know what that is, and frankly I don't care, it does not give you clinical authority in this hospital." Noted. "That's all you have to say?" She finished the entry and looked at him. "What would you like me to say, Victor?" The use of his first name registered. A small thing, but he'd always insisted on the title from nursing staff, and they both knew it. His jaw tightened slightly. "I want you to acknowledge that you've overstepped tonight in ways that are going to have professional consequences." "I've been your floor nurse for 3 years," she said, and her voice was so steady it was almost strange. "In that time, I have flagged 8 cases where your initial assessment missed something clinically significant. I documented each one. 6 of them resulted in the patient requiring a higher level of care than you'd ordered. I never made it a problem. I never went to administration. I did my job and I documented, and I let you have every room you needed." She looked at the tracking board. "Tonight, 5 people are alive who might not be if I'd waited for your direction. So yes, I've overstepped. I'll live with that." Sloan stared at her. It was the most she'd said to him directly in 3 years. He didn't have an immediate answer for it, and men like Sloan, men who ran on the fuel of never being caught without a response, went somewhere cold and careful when that happened. "You'll be suspended pending review," he said. "Effective end of shift." "Okay." He waited for more. She gave him none, and he walked away. Carver had been standing 12 feet back, close enough to have heard it. He said nothing when Sloan left, just moved to stand beside her. "He's going to be a problem," Carver said. "He's always been a problem." She reached for the next chart. "I'm used to it." "You shouldn't have to be." She looked at him sideways. "That's a nice sentiment. It doesn't change anything tonight." "It might." He said it carefully, like he was measuring the weight of it. "There's someone coming, Evelyn. Tomorrow morning, maybe sooner. I made some calls on the way in." She put down the chart slowly. "What kind of someone?" He met her eyes. "The kind with rank." She didn't respond to that. Not because she didn't understand what it meant, but because she understood it too well and needed a moment to decide how she felt about it. 3 years of chosen anonymity. 3 years of being Evelyn Brooks, floor nurse, invisible and deliberate and safe. She'd built that life with care. She'd built it because she needed something that couldn't be taken from her by an extraction gone wrong, or a classified mission that got too complicated, or a commanding officer who decided that the cost-benefit of her existence had shifted. She'd been so careful. "I didn't ask for that," she said finally. "I know." He paused. "But Dolan's alive because of you. Okafor's got a chance because of you. And Trevino..." He looked toward the bay. "Trevino has a daughter who's 4 years old. He shows me her picture every time we deploy. Every single time." He stopped. "You're allowed to let people acknowledge that." She didn't answer. From Bay 2, Patel's voice came through the open door. Not panicked, but elevated. "I need a second opinion in here. Someone's pressure just dropped." She was moving before he finished the sentence. Okafor's systolic had dropped from 94 to 71 in 4 minutes, which was either a slow internal bleed that had found a new vessel to catastrophize through or a vascular injury they'd missed on initial assessment. Patel had done everything right. 2 large-bore IVs, blood product order placed, Foley in, abdomen repalpated every 3 minutes. He hadn't missed anything. The body had just found a different way to go wrong. "Talk to me," she said, snapping on gloves. "Exit wound is clean, no active external bleeding. But his belly is getting more rigid on the right and his hematocrit is tanking." Patel's forehead was damp. "I think there's a mesenteric vessel involved." She palpated the abdomen herself, quick and methodical. He was right. The rigidity pattern had changed in the 12 minutes since intake. "You need to open him." "I need an attending to get Sloan or get the OR attending on call, whoever's faster. But do it now, and you go with them, because you know this abdomen and a cold surgeon coming in doesn't." She looked at Patel directly. "You've been doing everything right. Don't let anyone tell you differently in that OR." He swallowed, nodded, reached for the phone. She was back at the tracking board in 2 minutes. Morales had already taken the bilateral crush patient to the OR for a fasciotomy on the left leg, faster than she'd expected, which meant she'd underestimated him and filed that away. Trevino's neuroimaging showed a small subdural hematoma, stable for now, which meant watchful monitoring and a neurosurgical consult, and ideally, a conversation with the patient about the fact that walking off helicopters with head injuries was not, in fact, a demonstration of resilience. She was updating his status when the administrator arrived. His name was Gerald Whitmore, and he was the kind of hospital administrator who communicated importance through the quality of his shoes and the speed at which he walked. He'd clearly been called at home. His collar wasn't fully buttoned, and his tie was straight in the way of someone who'd straightened it in an elevator. And he'd come in fast enough that he was still processing the scope of what was happening as he crossed the ER floor. He took in the military operators, the trauma activity, the reconfigured bay layout, and the general state of organized intensity with an expression that moved quickly through surprise and landed on something harder. He found Sloan first. "Victor, what is the status of the surgical suite? Bay 2 patient is being taken up for emergency exploratory laparotomy. OR 3 is occupied with the leg case." Sloan's voice was controlled. He was in front of the administrator, and composure was a professional necessity. "We have 3 more in active management." "And who authorized the reconfiguration of the ER?" Whitmore looked at the corridor supply layout. "That's something I've been trying to address." Sloan's eyes moved to Evelyn. Whitmore followed the gaze. He didn't know her well. That was the reality of being a floor nurse in a large hospital. The administration knew the surgeons by name and the nurses as a collective noun. He frowned slightly, the way people do when they're searching for context that isn't there. "She needs to be removed from the active treatment area," Sloan said. "She's been acting without authorization all night. I've already notified HR." Whitmore looked at Evelyn. "Is this your reconfiguration?" "Yes." "On whose authority?" She kept her voice even. "On the authority of 5 people who needed immediate trauma management and a physical layout that didn't make that harder." "That's not—" He stopped, seemed to recalibrate. "That's not how this facility operates. We have protocols. We have chains of command. She is the reason 4 of your 5 trauma patients are stable," Carver said from across the room. Whitmore turned. He'd registered the military presence but hadn't engaged with it yet, and now he was looking at Carver, at the tactical gear, the unit patch, the quality of stillness that special operations personnel carry, the way the other operators in the room had quietly repositioned themselves to flank, and doing the political math. "Sir," Whitmore said carefully, "I understand your personnel are in a serious situation tonight, and I want to assure you that this facility is committed to— I want to be clear about something." Carver walked toward him at a measured pace, unhurried, which was somehow more impactful than moving fast. "These men serve under United States Special Operations Command. They were brought to this facility because we had reason to believe someone here could help them. That person, not your chief trauma attending, not anyone you'd have picked, is that nurse." He stopped. "If you move her out of this ER before every one of my people is stable, you will be interfering with the medical care of active duty military personnel during a national security operation. I will put that in writing, tonight." The room had gone very quiet. Whitmore's shoes were very good, but they weren't good enough for this conversation, and he seemed to know it. He looked at Sloan. Sloan looked back with the expression of a man who had just understood that the situation had moved out from under him and was still deciding whether to chase it. "She can continue," Whitmore said, with the controlled grace of a man who intended to have a very long conversation with his legal team in the morning. "Under supervision." "She doesn't need supervision," Carver said. "She needs people to get out of her way." Evelyn had stopped watching the exchange and gone back to the tracking board. Not because she didn't care. Because Trevino's last vitals check was overdue, and the board showed Sergeant Dolan's saturation had dipped 2 points, and there were exactly 4 tasks she needed to accomplish in the next 9 minutes. And none of them were going to complete themselves because someone in the room had finally said what she'd already known. She picked up the chart. She went back to work. By 3 in the morning, all 5 operators were stable. Not healed. 2 of them faced surgeries that would take months to recover from, and Trevino was going to need neurosurgical follow-up for the better part of a year. But stable. breathing, present. The particular aliveness that is the only thing a trauma team can actually promise. Evelyn was in the supply corridor refilling the crash cart when she heard it. A sound from the direction of the administrator's office. Raised voices, the kind that are trying not to be raised and failing. She caught Whitmore's voice, and then a voice she didn't recognize, and then a word that made her stop. Classified. She stood still for a moment, holding a box of syringes. Then Carver appeared at the end of the corridor. His face was different now. Not the operational focus of the last few hours, but something older, something she recognized from a long time ago, from a different version of her life. From debrief rooms and command tents, in the particular way news traveled, when it was the kind of news that changed things. "Someone's here," he said. "I heard." "Not tomorrow morning." He looked at her steadily. "Now." She set down the box of syringes. At the other end of the corridor, through the small wired glass window in the administrator's door, she could see a figure in uniform, dress uniform, not tactical, with enough rank on the shoulder to change the temperature of a room just by walking in. And she could see Whitmore's face through the glass, and she could see that the conversation he was having had stripped away every professional calculation he'd walked in with tonight. And whatever was in the folder that the uniformed figure had placed on his desk, whatever documents, whatever files, whatever part of her erased history had just been carried through the front door of Riverside Crest Medical Center in a manila envelope. It was enough. She could see it was enough. Her hands were very still. "Evelyn." Carver's voice was quiet. "It's time." She looked at the window for another moment. Then she looked down at her scrub top. Worn, slightly damp from the rain, the left sleeve still pushed up past the elbow where she'd never rolled it back down. The tattoo visible in the corridor light, faded and permanent and entirely hers. She took a breath, and she walked toward the door. The door to Whitmore's office was heavier than it looked. Evelyn noticed that because she'd walked through it exactly once before, 8 months ago, when Whitmore had called her in to discuss a patient complaint, a family member who'd felt she was too direct, which was a complaint that could mean anything and usually meant that someone had said something true in a room where truth was unwelcome. She'd sat in the chair across from his desk for 11 minutes and said what needed saying and left. The door had swung easily that time. Tonight it resisted, or felt like it did, which she understood was physics and not omen, but noted anyway. The man in dress uniform was a brigadier general. She knew the rank before she read the insignia, knew it from the way he held himself, from the specific quality of authority that accumulates over decades of being the person in the room that other people orient toward. He was in his late 50s, compact, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something more useful than handsome. He was standing rather than sitting, which meant he'd stood when he heard her coming, which meant he knew who she was and had decided in advance to offer that courtesy. His name tag said Ralston. She didn't know him. She knew of him distantly, the way you know names that appear in classified briefings. Not faces, just designations attached to decisions. He'd been in a different theater during her operational years, but the folder on Whitmore's desk was open, and from where she stood she could see the header on the top document, and her own name was there, her real name, her full name with her rank, and it hadn't been redacted. Whitmore was standing behind his desk with the posture of a man who had been told something that fundamentally reorganized his understanding of the last 3 years, and wasn't finished processing it yet. He looked at her when she came in, and for the first time in the entire time she'd worked at this hospital, he didn't seem entirely certain of what to say. "Ms. Brooks," he started. "Captain Brooks," Ralston said. His voice was even, not correcting so much as clarifying. The rank was never officially revoked, just administratively suppressed. He looked at Evelyn. "Which is one of the things we're here to address." She stayed near the door. Old habit. Never take a chair until you understand the room. "What's in the folder, General?" "Your service record, the complete version." He paused. "Not the one that's been in your personnel file here for 3 years." "I know what's been in my file." "I assumed." He pulled one sheet from the folder and set it on the front edge of the desk, angled so she could read it from where she stood without moving closer. "Operation Hollow Ridge, Phuong Province Extraction, March 11, 4 years ago. Do you want to tell Mr. Whitmore what happened, or should I?" She looked at Whitmore. He He was watching her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not the administrative distance he usually maintained, but something more unguarded. Like a man who'd discovered that the building he worked in had a different foundation than the blueprints showed. There was a 6-person extraction team, she said. We were pulling a compromised intelligence asset out of a denied access area. The route was burned. We took contact at the secondary exfil point. She kept her voice flat. The way you keep a voice flat when the content of what you're saying has weight and you've learned not to add your own to it. I was the senior medical officer. 2 of my team were down. I made a decision to hold the exfil point while the asset and the remaining operators extracted. The decision was not authorized. It was the right call, Ralston said. It was the call that kept the asset alive. She didn't agree or disagree about right. After extraction, the mission record was closed and my status was listed as KIA. I found out later that was a convenience for people who needed the record to read a certain way. Whitmore sat down slowly. You were listed as killed. Yes. And you've been working here for 3 years knowing that. I came here because I needed somewhere that wasn't connected to any of it. I needed to be a nurse. Just a nurse. She looked at the folder. I didn't expect the work to follow me. It didn't follow you, Carver said from the doorway. He'd come in behind her, quiet. We found you because Dolan's heart rate was dropping at 43,000 feet, and his medic was out of options, and someone in command remembered that Phantom was the best trauma operator they'd ever seen, and that the last confirmed location before the KIA report was Savannah, Georgia. He stopped. It was a guess, a desperate one. But here we are. Here we are. She looked at Ralston. What do you want, General? He picked up the folder. Tonight, I want to make sure your people are going to make it. After tonight, we talk about what comes next. He extended the folder toward her. But I think you should have this. It's yours. She crossed the room and took it. The paper was standard government stock, slightly cool from whatever bag it had been transported in, and her name was on it in official typeface, and it was everything she'd been before this building, before Savannah, before 3 years of being called a floor nurse by a man who'd never bothered to wonder what came before the floor. She held it for a moment, didn't read it. She knew what it said. She set it on the desk. After, she said. Right now I need to check on Trevino's pressure response and find out if Okafor's out of surgery. Ralston almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way. Of course. She walked back out into the ER and the folder stayed on the desk and the night kept moving. Okafor was out of surgery by 4:15 in the morning. Patel had gone in with the attending, a vascular surgeon named Dr. Ida Farnsworth, who'd been on call and had, to her credit, arrived within 12 minutes and let Patel scrub in without argument. And the mesenteric vessel had been what the presentation suggested, a partial laceration that had been oozing slowly and then found room to do more. They'd repaired it, resected a small section of compromised bowel, and closed. Okafor was in recovery, sedated, with numbers that looked like someone who was going to be angry about missing deployment rather than someone who was going to die. Patel found her at the tracking board and reported all of this with the tight, slightly stunned concision of someone who'd just done something they weren't entirely sure they were ready for and was only now starting to understand they'd done it correctly. You did good in there, she told him. He looked like he wanted to say something more and didn't know where to start. He settled for, You told me not to second-guess myself. And? I second-guessed myself twice, but I caught it both times. That counts, she said. He went to write his notes. She looked at the board. 5 patients, 5 names, all of them with vitals that were moving in directions that meant the right direction. It was the kind of board that, on any other night, would represent a shift's worth of accumulated effort and relief. Tonight, it felt both larger and more fragile than that, because she knew that in the office at the end of the corridor, a man with a general's stars had just opened a folder that was going to make the next several hours very complicated, and she hadn't fully decided yet how she felt about that. She was still looking at the board when Sloan found her again. He'd had time to think. She could tell. He had the controlled, slightly rehearsed quality of someone who'd spent the last 40 minutes composing a position. He stopped beside her at the board and looked at the same numbers she was looking at and said nothing for a moment, which was unusual for him. The surgery on the GSW patient, he said finally. Farnsworth said the resident caught the vascular involvement early. He did. You directed him. I pointed him in the right direction. He did the work. Sloane was quiet again. She waited because she'd learned a long time ago that silence costs you nothing. Who are you? He said. Not hostile, which was stranger than hostile would have been. Almost clinical, like a man trying to solve a problem. I've been here 3 years, Victor. That's not what I asked. She turned to look at him. In the flat overhead light, he looked older than he did in the daytime, when the performance of authority gave him a kind of energy. Right now, he looked like a tired man in a white coat who had been moving through a very long night and had arrived at a question he should have asked years earlier. Someone who does her job, she said. Same as I've always been. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not apology, not quite. Something more uncomfortable than that. Recognition, maybe. The kind that arrives too late and knows it. He walked away without saying anything else. She turned back to the board. It was Dolores who brought her coffee, real coffee, from the good machine in the break room, not the waiting room pot, and set it next to her without announcement. Evelyn looked at it and then at Dolores. You've known something was off for a while, Dolores said. It wasn't a question. About me? About you. Dolores leaned on the counter. She was a stout woman in her early 50s who had been a charge nurse for 16 years and had developed the particular quality of someone who had watched enough people move through crisis that she could read them the way a forecast reads weather. 3 years and you've never talked about where you worked before. You don't have nursing school friends. You know how to do things you shouldn't know how to do. She paused. I've been polite about not asking. I appreciate that. I'm not asking now either. Dolores straightened. I'm just saying, whatever's happening tonight, whatever comes after tonight, you were a good nurse before any of it came out. That's a fact that doesn't change. Evelyn looked at her coffee. Thank you, Dolores. Don't thank me. Drink the coffee. You've got 2 more hours of shift and Trevino's pressure has been doing something weird on and off for the last 20 minutes. She drank the coffee and went to check Trevino. His pressure instability turned out to be vascular, not the hematoma, but a small arteriovenous irregularity near the blast impact site that the initial imaging had shown as unremarkable, and that was now being remarkably less unremarkable. She caught it at 4:41, flagged it, had the neurosurgical fellow paged, and talked through the options with a brain surgeon named Dr. Ibarra, who was competent and methodical and annoyed at being woken up in the way that people are annoyed when they're actually awake and sharp, but feel that the annoyance is professionally appropriate. The call was to monitor it. The hematoma hadn't grown. The AV irregularity was small. Intervention carried more risk than watchful imaging at 2-hour intervals. She agreed with the assessment, documented her own observations, and set the timer herself so the 2-hour check didn't fall through the administrative cracks. It was during this, at 4:53, with the shift entering its last hours and the storm outside finally losing its worst energy, the rain settling into something steadier and less theatrical, that the additional personnel arrived. Not military this time. 3 people in suits, 2 men and a woman, arriving through the main entrance with the particular energy of government agents who were not accustomed to moving fast, and were moving fast anyway. They went to the administrator's office. Evelyn saw them cross the ER floor, but didn't stop what she was doing. Carver appeared at her elbow 12 minutes later. DOD investigators, he said quietly. They're here because of the KIA discrepancy. When Ralston filed the emergency declassification request tonight, it flagged an existing investigation into the Hollow Ridge record. He paused. Someone in the chain of command who authorized your KIA designation is under review. Has been for about 8 months. Your name coming back into the active record tonight. He stopped. Accelerates things. Yes. She processed that. Who? Colonel Maddox. He was your operational commander. She knew the name. Of course she knew the name. She'd known the name for 4 years, carried it the way you carry something you've decided not to put down, because the putting down will require a kind of reckoning you're not ready for. He's the one who filed the KIA report, she said. He's the one who authored it, yes. Carver kept his voice level. He's been investigated for 2 other record falsifications on different operations. Yours was the one they couldn't close because the record was too clean, too detailed. Someone who wasn't guessing had written it. He looked at her. They need a statement when you're ready. I know. Not tonight. I know that too. A monitor alarm sounded from Bay 3. Not critical, the kind of alarm that's a suggestion rather than a warning. And she moved toward it automatically, because the body keeps its rhythms regardless of what the mind is sorting through. And being a nurse was not a thing she'd done to hide. It was a thing she'd done because the work was real, and the need was real. And somewhere in the years of carrying classified grief, she'd discovered that putting her hands on someone who was hurt and doing something useful about it was the only activity that reliably made the inside of her head quiet. The alarm was a positional issue with one of the leg patient's sequential compression devices. She adjusted it, checked his vitals, stable, pain managed, sedated, and noted that the fasciotomy wound was clean and the edema was already beginning to ease in a way that suggested the intervention had been well-timed. She stood there for a moment in the dim bay, listening to the quieter monitors, the rain against the window, the distant movement of the hospital settling back toward its normal rhythms. Then Dolores's voice came from the corridor, elevated but controlled. Evelyn, Bay 1. Dolan. She moved fast. The sergeant's numbers had shifted in the last 8 minutes in a pattern she recognized before she reached the bedside. Pressure dropping, heart rate climbing. The chest tube output that had been modest and consistent, suddenly less consistent. He was awake, which he hadn't been an hour ago, and his eyes were moving with the rapid, slightly unfocused tracking of someone registering that something was wrong without being able to articulate what. Hey! She put her hand on his arm, but steady, present, not urgent in her touch, even when urgent in her pace. Dolan, I'm here. Can you tell me where the pain is? Chest. His voice was barely there. Right side. Different from before. Right side was the concerning part. The original pneumothorax had been left. Right side pain with pressure dropping in a patient who'd had traumatic chest injury was a pattern with a short list of causes, and none of them were benign. Dolores, I need a chest ultrasound in here now, and Paige, whoever's covering thoracic tonight, not in 5 minutes, right now. She was already reaching for the stethoscope. The breath sounds on the right were diminished. Not absent, diminished, with a quality that her hands and ears had learned over years to interpret before the imaging caught up. She pressed along the chest wall, noted the subtle shift in tracheal position, less pronounced than Dolan's original presentation, but there, and made the call. I need a needle decompression tray, right side. The nurse covering the bay, a young man named Garrett, who was good but still learning the difference between following protocol and reading a room, looked at her with the specific hesitation of someone who had been told all night that this woman's authority was being disputed. Dr. Sloan should... Garrett. She didn't raise her voice. Get me the tray or step aside and let someone else get it. But don't make me have this conversation in the next 30 seconds. He got the tray. She was prepping the site when Sloan came through the door at a half run. Someone had paged him, correctly, and took in the situation with the speed of an attending who, whatever his faults, had good clinical instincts when he stopped performing and started looking. He looked. He saw what she saw. Go ahead, he said. She went ahead. The needle went in at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and the release of pressure was immediate, the resistance in the plunger giving way, the characteristic sound, and then Dolan's breathing changing within 30 seconds, the chest expanding more symmetrically, the panic in his eyes losing its sharpest edge. Better? She asked him. Yeah, he said. Yeah. Good. Stay still. She looked at the monitoring numbers. Pressure stabilizing, heart rate beginning to slow from its climb. She held the needle in position and waited for the thoracic resident to arrive for proper chest tube placement because the needle was a bridge, not a destination, and the proper sequence mattered. Sloan was beside her. He'd gloved up. Right-sided tension, he said quietly, after a left-sided primary injury. Contra-coup mechanism possibly, or secondary injury from the transport positioning. You caught it fast. I've caught things fast for 3 years, she said, and there was no heat in it. Just fact. He didn't respond to that. He took over the needle positioning when the thoracic resident arrived so she could step back and document, and he did it correctly and calmly, and she noted that and noted that it didn't change the 8 clinical disagreements she'd had with him and had been right about or the 3 years of being called support personnel, but it also didn't not exist. People were complicated. That had always been true. By 5:45, Dolan was restabilized. The chest tube was placed, the output was appropriate, and his pressure had climbed back to a number that meant the right things. She was updating the chart when she heard it, the tone of conversation coming from the corridor shifting. Not louder exactly, but different. The particular register of people saying things that matter. She looked up. Through the glass partition of the nursing station, she could see into the corridor, and in the corridor she could see Ralston and the two investigators in suits, and Whitmore, and, behind them, someone else. Someone who had arrived while she was in Bay 1. Someone in uniform with more on the shoulder than Ralston, which made the back of her neck go still in the way it went still when things were about to become irreversible. Carver was standing at the door of the nursing station. His expression told her enough. "Who is that?" she asked. "Vice Admiral," he said. "Hargrove. She flew in from D.C. "A Vice Admiral. In this hospital, at 5:45 in the morning." "Why?" Carver's voice was very careful. "Because when Ralston filed the declassification request tonight and your name came back into the active record, it cross-referenced against the Maddox investigation file. And what came back—" He stopped. "What came back wasn't just your KIA designation, Evelyn. There were 5 other names in that Hollow Ridge file. 5 people listed as KIA on the same mission." She went very still. "2 of them," Carver said, "are alive." The tracking board hummed. The monitors beeped. The storm outside had gone down to a low drizzle, barely audible now. The worst of it moved on. She looked at him. "Who?" Her voice was quiet and very steady and contained something underneath that had been waiting 4 years for this specific question to have an answer other than silence. Carver said 2 names. She knew them both. She'd held one of them, held him with her hands pressed against a chest wound while a helicopter went somewhere without her. And she had believed, had been told, had built 3 years of a quiet life on the foundation of the fact that he hadn't made it. Her hands were not shaking. She was aware of this in the way you're aware of unusual things, noticing it, filing it, not trusting it entirely. "Where are they?" she asked. "That's what Hargrove is here to tell you." He looked at her steadily. "Evelyn, they were listed as KIA for the same reason you were. Someone needed the mission record closed. But they've been somewhere, under protection, under a different kind of suppression." She looked through the glass at the Admiral standing in her corridor, her ER. The building she'd walked into 3 years ago with a fabricated reference letter and a nursing license she'd earned in 6 months on accelerated track because the work had felt like the only honest thing left to do. "They're alive," she said, and the words didn't sound like a question, and didn't sound like relief, and didn't sound like anything she had a name for. "Yes." She set down the chart. She looked at her hands, the same hands that had worked through the night, that had done the needle decompression and the chest tube assist and the field-level decisions that people kept telling her were above her station. And they were just her hands, a little dry from the repeated gloving and ungloving, a small bruise developing at the base of her left thumb from where she'd caught the litter edge wrong in the parking lot 6 hours ago when this had all started. She walked toward the door of the nursing station, and Dolores said very quietly, from behind her, "Go." She pushed through the door. The Vice Admiral was a woman in her mid-60s with silver hair cut close and eyes that had spent decades looking at things without flinching. She watched Evelyn cross the corridor toward her with the expression of someone who had been briefed extensively and was now reconciling the briefing with the person in front of her, a nurse in worn scrubs with a damp collar and a military tattoo on her left forearm, and the particular quality of someone who had just worked a 6-hour trauma shift and was not done. "Captain Brooks?" Admiral Hargrove said. "Admiral." Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached into the case beside her and withdrew a sealed envelope. Not the standard manila of the folder Ralston had brought, but something stiffer, official, with a seal on the outer flap that Evelyn recognized. "There's something in here you need to see," Hargrove said, "before we talk about anything else." Evelyn looked at the envelope. She took it. She broke the seal. And the first line of the document inside contained a name she hadn't let herself say out loud in 4 years. And beside the name was a status designation, and the designation was not what she had believed it to be. And the room around her, the corridor, the ER, the monitors, the rain, went very distant for exactly 1 second. Then she looked up at Hargrove. "I want to see him," she said. The Admiral's expression shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't not one. "That," she said, "is why I'm here." That, she said, "is why I'm here." The document was 3 pages. Evelyn read all 3 standing in the corridor under fluorescent light with the sounds of the ER behind her. Monitors, the distant rattle of a supply cart, someone's quiet voice on a phone. And she read it the way she'd learned to read orders and field reports and casualty lists, which was without letting the meaning arrive all at once. You took it in pieces. You processed each piece before moving to the next. You did not let the whole of it hit you while you were still standing somewhere you needed to function. The name was Marcus Tell, Staff Sergeant, Hollow Ridge Extraction Team, listed KIA March 11, 4 years ago. Current status: alive, relocated under protective suppression, location classified pending investigation resolution. The second name was Corporal Dana Fisk, same mission, same designation, same current status. The document used the phrase administrative mortality designation 3 times, which was bureaucratic language for a lie that someone in a position of authority had decided was necessary and had filed the paperwork on. Evelyn folded the document along its original crease and held it at her side. Hargrove had waited. She had the stillness of someone who understood that this moment needed space around it, and had the discipline not to fill that space prematurely. "Where are they?" Evelyn asked. "Tell is at a medical facility in Virginia. Has been for 14 months. He was injured during the period of suppression, unrelated to the original mission." Hargrove's voice was measured and careful without being cold. "Fisk is in Seattle, employed, intact. She's been waiting for the investigation to reach a resolution point before making contact with anyone from the unit. She knew I was listed as KIA. They both did. They were told the same thing you were told about them." A pause. Colonel Maddox was thorough. The name landed the same way it had when Carver said it, not like a surprise, but like a confirmation of something she'd known in her body for 4 years without having the documentation to name it. You build a theory over time from the shape of an absence, from the things that don't quite add up, from the fact that the report was too clean and the timeline was too tight, and the person who delivered the notification of her KIA status, a captain she'd never fully trusted, had looked at a point 18 inches above her head during the entire conversation instead of at her face. "He's the one who personally notified our next of kin contacts," Evelyn said. "Yes. He told my sister I was dead." Hargrove held her gaze. "Yes, that's part of what's under investigation." The corridor felt very quiet for a moment despite the noise around it. Evelyn thought about her sister, Nora, who lived in Portland and taught middle school science and had sent a card to an old P.O. box that Evelyn had quietly reestablished contact through in the 2nd year of her time at Riverside Crest, carefully, obliquely, using a mutual friend as a buffer. Nora thought she was estranged. That was the fiction that had felt survivable. Not dead, just gone in the way that people go when the life they were living becomes incompatible with the life they need. She hadn't told Nora the truth because she hadn't known how much of the truth was hers to tell. The suppression hadn't come with a manual. "What happens now?" she asked. "The investigation moves to a formal hearing phase. Maddox's file goes to JAG. Your record is restored, the full record, not the adjusted version." Hargrove stepped slightly closer, lowering her voice by reflex, though there was no one immediately adjacent. "There will be people who want to put you in a room and debrief you for 3 days, and then offer you a role that comes with a title and a salary and a desk somewhere with good security clearance. That's going to happen regardless of what you want. But it doesn't have to happen tonight, and it doesn't have to define what comes next." Evelyn looked at her. "You're not here just to deliver documents." "No." "What are you here for?" Hargrove considered her answer. "I'm here because I read your Hollow Ridge file 8 months ago when the Maddox investigation opened. The full file. Not the adjusted one. The original reconstruction that the investigators pulled from secondary sources. Your field decisions during that extraction saved 6 lives, including the asset, who has since provided intelligence that contributed to 3 separate mission successes." She paused. "You were given a KIA designation for making the right call. I've spent 8 months waiting for the investigation to get far enough along that I could stand in front of you and say that plainly. So, that's why I'm here." Evelyn didn't say anything for a moment, The document was still in her hand, folded along its crease, Marcus Tell's name inside it. "Thank you," she said finally. It was simple. She didn't elaborate. Hargrove nodded once. The administrator's door opened and Ralston came out, and behind him came one of the suited investigators, and behind him came Gerald Whitmore with the expression of a man who had aged visibly in the last 2 hours and was now navigating the specific kind of institutional humility that comes from discovering that a personnel decision you'd been about to ratify, a suspension, an HR file, a process that would have ended cleanly on paper, was in fact something else entirely. He looked at Evelyn. Captain Brooks. He used the title carefully, like a word he was trying out. "I owe you an apology, several of them." "You can start with tonight," she said. Not unkindly, not warmly either. "The rest we can address when everyone in my ER is stable and I've had some sleep." He absorbed that. "Of course. Yes." He looked at the floor, then back up. "Is there anything you need for the patients, for the staff? Anything this facility can provide tonight that we haven't already? The supply corridor needs to be restocked before the day shift comes on. The crash cart in Bay 2 needs a log review, and Dr. Patel needs to be in the record as the primary on the Okafor case, not as assisting. He ran that surgery and his file should reflect it." She met Whitmore's eyes. "That's what I need tonight." He wrote nothing down, but he nodded with the particular attention of someone who understands they've been given a test as much as a list. "Done." She walked back toward the nursing station. The sky outside the window at the end of the corridor had begun its very early change. Not light yet, not even close, but a slight recession of the deepest dark. The rain had thinned to something barely there. She could hear it less than feel it, a faint persistence against the glass. Dolores was at the station. She looked at Evelyn's face with her charge nurse read-everything expression and said nothing, which was exactly right. Evelyn picked up the tracking board and reviewed each patient in sequence. What happened next happened because she was doing her job, because she was checking the log on Trevino's 2-hour imaging cycle and noticed that someone had reset the timer without completing the corresponding documentation, which meant either the imaging had been done and not charted, or the timer had been reset without imaging being done, and in either case she needed to find out. She went to Trevino's bay. He was awake, more awake than he'd been earlier, which was either a good sign or a sign that the intracranial pressure had shifted in a direction that was presenting as alertness before the next phase of something less good. She assessed him quickly. Pupils now equal, reactive, left pupil returned to symmetry with the right. And that was genuinely good. She asked him standard orientation questions, and he answered them correctly, including the date, which most people got wrong in the hospital at 5 in the morning without a brain injury. "You were counting," he said, while she checked his grip strength. "Counting what?" "Everything. When you came out to the parking lot, you were counting seconds between things." He looked at her with the direct gaze of someone who'd spent a career reading environments for threat information. "Like you were running a timeline." "Old habit." "Military?" She looked at him. He already knew the answer. Carver would have told the team by now, or they'd have put it together themselves. These were people whose professional survival depended on accurate pattern recognition. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "How long out?" 4 years? Miss it?" She thought about how to answer that honestly and decided the honest answer was complicated enough to not fit in this room at this hour. "I miss the people," she said. "I don't miss the parts that ended with me here." He seemed to accept that. Then, "You saved Dolan's life twice tonight." "The team saved his life. I just managed the process." "That's what we do too." He said it simply, without performance. "Manage the process." And then someone in a brief calls it a mission success, and you say, "Yeah, okay, that's what it was." He paused. "You should let it be that." She finished documenting his neurocheck. "Get some sleep, Trevino. Your daughter needs you functional." He looked startled. Then something softened in his face. Not sentimentality, just the real thing underneath. "Carver told you about her." He mentioned the photo. "I've got a better one now. Birthday last month." He looked at the ceiling. "She's learning to swim. She's not very good yet. Keeps trying to do it without getting her face wet." He almost smiled. "Stubborn as hell." "Good," Evelyn said. "She'll need that." She left his bay and walked back through the ER, and what she found at the nursing station was not what she'd left. Sloane was there. But so was a woman she didn't recognize, 40s, dark suit, lanyard identifying her as hospital legal counsel. And so was a man in a different suit who had the specific quality of someone from outside the hospital who had arrived with a purpose. And Whitmore was there, looking like a man attempting to hold a position he was no longer certain he owned. The man in the suit said, when he saw Evelyn, "Captain Brooks, my name is Alderton. I'm with the DoD Office of Inspector General. I was on a call with General Ralston 40 minutes ago, and I understand you've been briefed on the nature of this visit. Partially. There are some things I need to clarify, and I'd rather do it now before the shift change complicates access." He glanced at Whitmore. "Privately." "I'm not going anywhere private until I've finished my shift notes," she said. "Whatever you need to tell me, you can tell me while I work." Alderton looked like someone who hadn't been told that before and was recalculating. He recalculated. "All right." He moved to stand near her at the station, lowering his voice. "The Maddox investigation has been building toward a formal charges recommendation for 6 months. Your reappearance in the active record tonight, coming through an emergency military medical request, triggered an automatic cross-reference that pulled 3 files simultaneously, yours, Tell's, and Fisk's. It also pulled something else." She kept typing. "What?" "A 4th name. Someone who was not on the Hollow Ridge team, but who was named in Maddox's communication records from the period surrounding the mission. Someone who corresponded with Maddox twice in the week before the extraction and once the day after, the day the KIA designations were filed." She stopped typing. "We've been trying to identify the significance of that correspondence for 8 months, Alderton said. Tonight, when your file came through, the investigators cross-referenced the 4th name against the Riverside Crest staff directory as a routine location check." He paused. "The name came back as an active employee." The ER hummed around her. "Who?" she asked, though some part of her, the part that had spent 3 years making sense of a building, learning its people, reading the rooms and the histories and the things nobody said directly, already had a shape forming. Alderton said the name. It wasn't Sloane. That was the thing she hadn't predicted, had, in the back of her processing, assumed because Sloane was the obvious antagonist, the visible one, the one who'd been in her way since her first week. But it wasn't Sloane. It was Whitmore. Gerald Whitmore, hospital administrator, who had been in his position for 6 years, who'd come to Riverside Crest 2 years before she had, who'd had a prior career in federal health administration that she'd never had reason to look at too closely. Whitmore, who had looked at her tonight with the expression of a man receiving new information, but who might instead have been a man registering that the information he'd had was finally catching up to him. She turned around slowly. Whitmore was at the edge of the station. He'd heard. She could see it in the way his body had changed, a very small, very controlled stillness that was different from his earlier discomfort. This was the stillness of someone who had known something was coming and had been waiting to see which direction it came from. "Gerald," she said. He looked at her. And in his eyes, behind the administrative composure, behind the expensive shoes and the hurried collar, and the man managing the crisis of the last 2 hours, she saw something she recognized from a long time ago, from a different version of the world. She saw the particular expression of someone calculating whether they still had options. He straightened. "I'd like to contact my attorney." "That's your right," Alderton said. "I'm going to need you to step away from the floor," said the second investigator, who had appeared from somewhere without Evelyn noticing. Whitmore looked at Evelyn one more time. It wasn't a plea. It was an assessment. "You didn't know," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I do now." They walked him toward the administrator's office. Not handcuffs. Not yet. That wasn't how this worked at this stage. But with the deliberate flanking proximity of people who weren't going to let someone make a decision in the wrong direction. The corridor watched. Dolores watched. 2 of the night nurses watched from the doorway of Bay 4. Carver, who had appeared from somewhere, watched with the expression of a man confirming a conclusion he'd arrived at independently. The ER was very quiet for about 4 seconds. Then a monitor alarmed from Bay 1. Dolan, saturation fluctuation, nothing critical but needing attention. And Evelyn went to it, because that was what you did. The building moved around the thing that had just happened and kept moving, because buildings do that, hospitals especially. And the work didn't organize itself around anyone's need for a moment to process. She adjusted Dolan's oxygen. He stirred, but didn't wake. Hey, Carver said from the doorway. Hey, you okay? She looked at Dolan's face, young, slack with sedation, color coming back into it in the slow way that meant the body was doing the correct things. I'm still processing. That's reasonable. How long did you know? About Whitmore. I didn't, not specifically. He leaned against the doorframe. We knew there was someone inside the information chain who'd flagged Savannah as a location point. That's how I knew to route the helicopters here tonight instead of to Grady. Someone had been monitoring something. He paused. I thought it was Maddox extending his reach. I didn't have the name until Alderton said it. Whitmore was the one who told Maddox I was here. That's what they think, yes. She looked at that for a moment. The shape of it, the 3 years of being watched without knowing it, of an administrator who'd looked at her personnel file and recognized a name that didn't quite fit the resume and had made a phone call to someone who needed to know, and had then, for 3 years, kept her close. Let her work. Let her be just a floor nurse, maybe waiting to see what she'd do, maybe waiting for the investigation to end in a way that meant she'd never have to do anything at all. He didn't try to remove me tonight, she said. No. He defended me. Twice. Against Sloan. I noticed. Carver's voice was measured. People are complicated. She thought about Whitmore's face when he'd said you didn't know. The fact of it. The strange fact that a man who'd been passing her location to the person who'd had her declared dead had also, on this specific night, defended her against a surgeon who was trying to end her career. People contain too many things at once, always, and the accounting never fully balanced. It doesn't change what he did, she said. No, it doesn't. She finished checking Dolan's settings and came out of the bay. The sky through the corridor window was definitely lighter now. Not dawn. Dawn was still 30 minutes away. But the gray preceding it, the color of something that hasn't decided yet. The rain was done. She could see the parking lot wet and empty, except for the 2 Blackhawks, which sat tilted slightly on the asphalt like birds that had landed and weren't sure they were staying. Sloan was at the nursing station when she returned. He'd watched the Whitmore departure. She could see it in his face, the processing of it, the reconfiguration of his understanding of the last 6 years, which presumably included moments where Whitmore had supported Sloan's institutional authority in ways that now had a different possible interpretation. He looked smaller than he had at the start of the shift. Not diminished exactly, but recalibrated, like something that had been running on the wrong information and was now adjusting to the correct scale. I've been a problem for you, he said. She looked at him steadily. Yes. I didn't know. He stopped. That's not an excuse. What I didn't know is on me. I made assumptions about what you were, and I made it your problem. He looked at the station. The Marchetti case, 8 months ago. The patient I said was musculoskeletal. She remembered it immediately. Of course she did. He went to ICU 6 hours after your discharge order. GI bleed, ruptured the anterior mesenteric. I know. I reviewed the file the next morning. His jaw moved. I knew then. I knew you'd been right and I'd dismissed you, and a man had spent 6 hours in worse condition than he needed to. He looked at her. I didn't apologize. I updated my clinical notes and I moved on. I know you did. That's not what a good physician does. No. She held his gaze. It's not. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the silence became an acknowledgement in itself. I'm going to submit a self-reported review to the medical board. My conduct toward nursing staff, documentation of the cases, all of it. He said it like someone who'd decided something on a long drive and was now getting out of the car. It should have happened a long time ago. She looked at him for a moment. Victor Sloan, 47, chief trauma attending, genuinely good surgeon, genuinely difficult man, standing in his own ER at 6 in the morning with less certainty than he'd arrived with. She thought about how easy it would be to say something that would clarify exactly what she'd thought of him for 3 years. She had the material. She'd been building it for a long time. Okay, she said instead. He nodded, turned, walked to his office. She didn't feel generous. She didn't feel like what she'd said was kindness. She felt like someone who was too tired and too full of the night's actual weight to put any energy into the satisfaction of a surgical precision takedown, and who was starting to understand that the real accounting wasn't between her and Victor Sloan anyway. It was between her and a colonel named Maddox, and a system that had decided she was an acceptable cost. That accounting was still coming. Ralston found her at 6:15 in the break room, where she'd gone to finish the coffee Dolores had made her 2 hours and a lifetime ago. It was cold. She drank it anyway. "The formal hearing is scheduled for 3 weeks out," he said. "JAG is filing the charges recommendation against Maddox tomorrow morning, which becomes public record at that point." He sat across from her, asking with the gesture whether she minded, which she appreciated. "Your testimony will be central. We'll want it on record before the hearing." "When?" "We can do it here, in Savannah, this week, if you're willing." He looked at his hands. I know none of this is what you planned when you came here 3 years ago." "No." "For whatever it's worth, what you did tonight was not invisible. The people in those bays are going to go home to their families. That's because you were here." She looked at the cold coffee in the cup. "Trevino told me to let it be a mission success." "Smart man." "He is." She was quiet for a moment. "What about Tell?" "Marcus. When can I—" "We're arranging transport for him. He's mobile now. The injury was 8 months ago. He's been in rehab. He wanted to come as soon as the file was opened, but the investigators asked him to wait for the hearing process." Ralston met her eyes. "He's been asking about you since the investigation started. Every briefing. First question, every time." She pressed her lips together, set down the cup. "He'll be at the hearing," Ralston said. "Fisk, too." She nodded once. That was all she could give that right now. The rest of it, the conversation she'd been unable to have in her head for 4 years, because the person she'd need to have it with was supposed to be dead, that was too large for 6:15 in the morning after a shift like this one. She stood up. "I need to finish my shift notes," she said. "The day team comes on in 45 minutes, and they need a clean handoff." Ralston looked at her. "Of course." He stood too. "Captain." He said it with the particular weight of someone using a title that had been put in a box and was now back out in the light. She walked back out to the ER. The day shift was beginning to arrive. Early ones. The ones who came in with 20 minutes to spare and changed in the locker room and came out with fresh scrubs and coffee from outside. They filtered in slowly, took in the state of the ER with the practiced read of people who could interpret a trauma night from the condition of the supply corridor and the configuration of the bays, and they found their positions quietly. Evelyn walked them through the board case by case. Dolan, Okafor, the bilateral leg patient, Trevino, the fourth operator who had been admitted and stabilized overnight with a wound infection on top of the blast injury. She gave each case cleanly: status, interventions, outstanding orders, what to watch for, what had changed. She answered 2 questions. She did not editorialize. She was signing out the last chart when she noticed that the day shift charge nurse, a man named Barton, competent and reliable, who had been at Riverside Crest for 9 years, was looking at her with an expression she didn't immediately place. "What?" she asked. He looked at the board, then back at her. "I heard what happened tonight. Word travels." He paused. "We all did. The night staff." He said it carefully, like someone testing the weight of what he's holding before deciding how much to lift. "We've been working next to you for 3 years." "I know." "We didn't know." "I know that too." He nodded slowly. Then, "It doesn't change what we know. About you. About the work." He shrugged, slightly awkward in the way people are when sincerity arrives without its usual packaging. "Just thought that was worth saying." She looked at him for a moment. This building, these people, this floor where she'd been called support personnel and just another nurse, and where she'd documented 8 clinical corrections and never made them into a confrontation and had eaten half a granola bar standing up more times than she could count. "Thank you, Barton," she said. She logged out of the system. She was collecting her bag from her locker when Dolores appeared in the locker room doorway. The charge nurse leaned against the frame with her arms crossed and looked at Evelyn with the particular expression she wore when she'd decided something. "Your suspension notice," Dolores said. "Sloan filed it at 2 this morning. Whitmore countersigned it." She paused. "Whitmore is currently in a room with federal investigators. Sloan has withdrawn it." She tilted her head. "So as of right now, you're on scheduled days off, not suspended." "Okay. Come back when you're ready." Evelyn closed her locker. "I'll be back Thursday." Dolores smiled. It was the small, real kind. Good. The day team already can't find the crash cart log you reorganized. She walked out through the ER one more time. Bay 1. Dolan, sleeping. The monitor steady and unhurried. Bay 2. Okafor, also sleeping. The fluid balance on the board looking exactly right. The corridor quiet. The overhead lights warm now rather than clinical flat, in the way they got when the day shift arrived, and something about the human body's relationship with morning adjusted the perception of the same fluorescent bulbs. She pushed through the ambulance bay doors and went outside. The parking lot was wet. The two Blackhawks were still there, with ground crew she hadn't seen before moving around them, checking systems, preparing for transport. The sky was coming. Gray and pink at the low edge, dark still above. The particular sky of early morning in Georgia after a storm, clean and cool and smelling of wet asphalt and pine from the tree line at the far edge of the lot. Carver was standing outside. She stopped beside him. They stood there for a moment without speaking, watching the sky happen. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "Go home. Sleep." She looked at the tree line. "Thursday I come back. And after that, the hearing, the record, the one thing at a time." He nodded. Then, "For what it's worth, what I said last night about people spending years thinking you were dead." He paused. "I meant that. We grieved you. The whole unit." He stopped. "Some of us more than others." She looked at him. She knew what he meant by that. She'd known for 4 years what she'd walked away from, what the KIA designation had cost more than her. And she'd carried that in the specific, sealed-off way of someone who doesn't open a container they can't afford to have open in the wrong circumstances. "Marcus," she said. "Yeah. Is he—" She stopped, tried again. "What does he know about tonight?" "I texted his handler at 4 this morning, 2 words. Carver looked at her. "She's alive." He paused. "He's been awake since." The sky kept brightening at its edges. One of the ground crew walked around the nose of the nearest helicopter and crouched to check something on the landing gear, and the wet asphalt reflected the sky in broken pieces, pink and gray and dark. She breathed out. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks. She picked up her bag from where she'd set it against the wall. Walked toward the parking lot. Got about 12 steps before she stopped. Because across the lot, parked at the far edge near the visitor entrance where it hadn't been earlier tonight, was a black government sedan, and standing next to it, not moving, just standing, as if he'd been standing there long enough to understand that moving wasn't his call to make, was a man. She could see enough at this distance to see the cane. The particular way of standing that compensated for something in the left leg. The way he was facing her direction but not quite looking at her directly, in the way of someone who has been told to wait and is honoring that but barely. She went very still. Across 40 feet of wet asphalt, he looked up. 4 years collapsed into a single second, and the thing she'd kept sealed opened all at once, and she was walking before she'd decided to, and the ground crew and the helicopters and Carver and the hospital behind her went somewhere else entirely, and there was only the wet parking lot and the morning sky, and the man with the cane who had been dead and was not, who had been gone and was here, who had spent 4 years in the same sealed grief she'd been in, and who was now walking toward her, slowly, the cane giving him a rhythm that was unfamiliar, that told her something about the 8 months in a rehabilitation facility, about the unrelated injury, about the distance between who they'd both been and who they were now. They stopped 3 feet apart. She looked at his face. She hadn't let herself imagine it. Not clearly, not since the first year when she'd learned that imagination in that specific direction cost too much. His face was older. Of course it was. And there was a scar at the jawline that hadn't been there before, and he was thinner, and his eyes had something in them that she recognized because she'd seen it in her own mirror every morning for 4 years. The particular quality of someone who has been carrying a weight that should have been shared. "Hey," Marcus Tell said. She had about 40 words ready. Prepared over 4 years, revised, discarded, re-prepared. She'd thought about this conversation with the specific detail of someone who hadn't been allowed to have it, who'd rehearsed it the way you rehearse something you believe you'll never actually perform. "Hey," she said. And then she closed the 3 feet of distance, and he took the last step, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. And the morning came in full over the Georgia tree line, and the helicopter rotors began to turn for departure, and behind them the hospital kept running with the relentless, necessary momentum of a building full of people who needed care. But Alderton had said something in the corridor that she had filed away without yet examining, a detail in Whitmore's communication record with Maddox that he'd mentioned and then moved past, that she'd let go in the moment because there were 5 patients and a shift to finish. The correspondence had included one exchange, he'd said, that the investigators had not yet been able to fully decode. Encrypted. Dated 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago. Not 4 years ago. Not the period surrounding Hollow Ridge. 2 weeks ago, Gerald Whitmore had sent an encrypted message to a contact in Colonel Maddox's network, and the investigators did not yet know what it said, and Maddox's legal team had already filed a motion to restrict document access in the JAG proceeding, and the motion had been filed the same day as the message. She stood in this parking lot with Marcus Tell's arm around her shoulders, and the morning arriving and her shift finally over, and the thought arrived quietly, the way the most important thoughts usually did. Maddox had known, 2 weeks ago, that something was moving toward him, and he had sent a message through Whitmore to someone she hadn't identified yet, and she did not know what it said. And the hearing was in 3 weeks, and somewhere in the chain between a colonel with a falsified mission record and a hospital administrator who'd spent 3 years watching her work, there was a thread she hadn't pulled yet, and she had a feeling, the specific evidence-based feeling of someone who had learned to read patterns at a level below language, that the thread led somewhere that wasn't finished. She looked at the morning sky over Savannah. She was not done. She didn't sleep. She meant to. She drove home through streets that were still wet from the storm, the sky going full pink and gold over the rooftops. And she sat in the parking lot of her apartment building for 4 minutes without getting out of the car. And she went inside and stood in her kitchen and put the kettle on and stood there watching it, and thought about the encrypted message and Maddox's legal motion and the thread she hadn't pulled yet, and by the time the kettle boiled, she had already picked up her phone. She called Alderton at 7:12 in the morning. He answered on the second ring, which told her he hadn't slept either. "The message," she said. "The encrypted one from 2 weeks ago. Where are you on it?" A pause. "We have a partial decode. The encryption is a variant of a commercial protocol that Maddox's network has used before. We recognize the structure, which is why we flagged it. But the content is behind a secondary layer that our technical team hasn't fully broken yet." Another pause, shorter. "Why?" "Because Maddox filed the document restriction motion the same day, which means he knew something was moving toward him and he was trying to slow it down. And the message went out through Whitmore, which means Whitmore wasn't just a historical contact. He was still operational." She leaned against her kitchen counter. "What was the recipient address?" "That's the part I can't give you over an unsecured line." "Is it someone at this hospital?" Silence, which was its own answer. "Alderton." "Get some sleep, Captain. We're working it." He ended the call. She put the phone down and drank her tea standing at the window, watching the street below come awake in the slow, ordinary way of a Wednesday morning in Savannah. A man walking a dog, a delivery truck, a woman in scrubs heading toward a bus stop with the particular posture of someone at the end of a night shift. Ordinary. Persistent. The city doing what cities do, regardless of what any individual building inside them contained. She thought about the hospital, about the people who came on Thursday morning with fresh scrubs and outside coffee, about the 4 walls of the ER and the tracking board and Dolores at the station and the crash cart that still needed its log reviewed, about the fact that whoever Maddox had messaged 2 weeks ago, whoever was still inside that building, still connected to the network that had declared her dead and kept Marcus Tell in administrative limbo for 4 years, would still be there on Thursday when she walked back in. She put down the tea and went to sleep. Not because she'd stopped thinking, but because she'd spent enough years in operational environments to know that thinking without rest produces the same quality of output as equipment running without maintenance, functional on the surface, failing underneath. She slept for 6 hours, hard and flat, no dreams she remembered. She woke at 2 in the afternoon to 3 missed calls from Carver, one from a number she didn't recognize, and a text from Alderton that said only, "Come in, bring nothing, we found it." The DoD field office in Savannah occupied the 3rd floor of a building downtown that presented itself as a federal administrative annex and had the particular anonymity of spaces that are designed not to draw attention. Alderton met her in the lobby. He looked like someone who had drunk too much coffee and had replaced sleep with purpose, which she recognized as a viable short-term strategy and an unsustainable long-term one. He didn't make small talk. He walked her to a room on the third floor with a table, 2 chairs, a laptop, and Ralston sitting against the far wall with the expression of a man who had been given information and was managing his reaction to it with professional effort. "Sit down," Alderton said. She sat. He opened the laptop and turned it toward her. On the screen was a decoded message, sparse, the language stripped of anything identifying, the way operational communications always were. But the meaning was clear enough. The recipient wasn't a name she knew. It was a position title, Chief of Staff, Riverside Crest Medical Center, a position that had been vacant for 2 months. The previous holder had retired, and that had a replacement named and pending board approval. The name pending approval was Dr. Victor Sloan. She read the message twice. Its content, decoded, was a direction. If the investigation reached the hospital, if anyone came asking about Brooks, Sloan was to ensure she was removed from the facility before she could be interviewed. Quietly, cleanly, professionally. A suspension would do. A termination would be better. The message outlined 2 specific complaint vectors. Maddox's network had prepared. Patient safety concerns, scope of practice violations. Both of them fabricated. Both of them documented in a file that was ready to be submitted to the state nursing board the moment it was needed. The timing of Sloan's self-reported review request, filed at 6 this morning, shortly after the investigators had taken Whitmore, looked different now. A man get ahead of something. "He knew," she said. "We believe he was approached approximately 2 months ago, around the time his chief of staff candidacy was formalized. We don't yet know whether he was a willing participant or whether he understood the full scope of what he was being asked to do." Alderton kept his voice measured. But he had the file. It was on a drive registered to his hospital login, and he didn't report it. She looked at the screen. The self-reported review. Filed after Whitmore was taken out of the building. Yes. He paused. People make calculations. Sometimes they make them at the last possible moment and call it conscience. It's not nothing, but it's also not the same as doing the right thing when it costs something. She sat with that. Sloan had spent the night defending her, or appearing to, in increments. He'd told Garrett to stand down. He'd called her instinct correct in the bay. He'd stood in the ER at 6 in the morning and admitted the Marchetti case to her face in a way that had felt, in the exhausted aftermath of a full trauma night, like something real. And it might have been real. And he had also been sitting on a file designed to end her career and hadn't told anyone. People were, as Carver had said, complicated. It didn't resolve neatly. It didn't need to. "What happens to him?" she asked. "That depends on what his cooperation looks like in the next 48 hours. If he hands over the full correspondence and testifies to the contact, it helps the Maddox case significantly. If he lawyers up and goes quiet, we build it differently." Alderton looked at her. "Either way, the chief of staff appointment is over. The board was notified an hour ago." She nodded. "Are you all right?" Ralston asked from across the room. He'd been quiet throughout. The question was direct without being intrusive. "I'm figuring out how to be," she said, which was the honest answer, and she'd spent enough time in rooms with people who expected polished answers that the honest one felt almost strange to say. He accepted it without comment. She looked at the decoded message on the screen one more time. 4 years of her life, 3 years of being called just a floor nurse, a tattoo on her left arm that she'd kept covered most days. Not because she was ashamed of it, but because she didn't want the questions. All of it running back to a colonel who'd decided the cost-benefit of her existence had shifted, and a system that had agreed with him quietly, in paperwork, in the specific bureaucratic violence of a box checked wrong. She looked at Alderton. "What do you need from me?" "A formal statement. On the record, today if possible. Everything from Hollow Ridge forward, the mission, the extraction decision, the notification you received about your KIA status, the 3 years here." He paused. "We want the full picture." "How long?" "As long as it takes." She looked at Ralston. "We have a stenographer downstairs," he said, "and better coffee than whatever that annex machine makes." She almost smiled. "All right," she said. "Let's start." It took 4 hours. She told it the way it had happened. Not linearly, because it hadn't happened linearly, but in the order that the truth of it required. The extraction. The contact at the secondary exfil point. The two team members down, the asset compromised. The call she'd made to hold the point with Sergeant Tell while the remaining operators moved. The helicopter going without her, the hours after, and the captain who'd arrived with the notification and the eyes that wouldn't meet hers. The 6 months of attempting to clarify her status through official channels, running against locked doors and misdirections, and the specific institutional indifference of a system that had already made a decision. The nursing license. Savannah. The locker room at Riverside Crest on her first day, putting on scrubs that didn't have a rank attached, deciding that this was survivable. She told it without self-pity and without performance. The stenographer's fingers moved steadily. Alderton asked clarifying questions in the flat, precise way of someone building a legal architecture, and she answered them with the same quality, because the truth was detailed and the details mattered, and she'd spent 4 years keeping them in order in case this moment arrived. When it was over, she signed the statement and drank the better coffee and sat for a moment in the quiet of the room. Marcus Tell was in the building. He'd arrived while she was giving the statement, waited in a different room. She'd seen him briefly in the hallway when she came out, and he'd looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has reconfigured their understanding of what's possible and is still adjusting to the new configuration. She'd put a hand on his arm for a moment and kept walking, because the conversation they needed to have was not a hallway conversation and not a today conversation, and he knew that too. And the fact that they both knew it without saying it was something she'd think about later, in a quieter moment. Dana Fisk had sent a message through the investigators. 3 sentences. I heard about last night. I knew you'd be the first one back in. I'll see you at the hearing. 3 sentences that contained everything, the way 3 sentences sometimes do. The hearing was on a Tuesday, 3 weeks later, in a federal building in Atlanta. Evelyn drove up the night before and stayed in a hotel that was clean and featureless and suited her fine. She sat at the desk in the room and looked at the folder Ralston had given her. The complete service record, restored, the rank and the decorations and the commendations and the correct version of the Hollow Ridge mission outcome, which documented her decision as tactically sound and operationally decisive, which was what it had been and what 4 years of paperwork had buried. She didn't read it. She'd read it twice already. She put it in her bag and went to sleep. The hearing room was formal and wood-paneled and full of the specific tension of spaces where institutional power is being asked to account for itself. JAG officers at one table, Maddox's legal team at another, a panel of 3 senior officers at the front. Ralston and Hargrove were present in an advisory capacity. Alderton sat with the investigators along one wall. Maddox was there. She hadn't seen him in 4 years, and she'd thought about this moment in the abstract way you think about things you believe might never happen. He was older. Of course, everyone was older. And he sat with the upright posture of military training that doesn't leave the body even when everything else does. And when she entered the room, he looked at her with an expression she read in about 1 second. Calculation, not remorse. I was looking at the board, not at what he'd done. That told her everything she needed to know about how he'd lived with it. She sat where she was directed, and she told the hearing panel what she'd told the investigators. And she told it the same way. Factual, sequenced, detailed, without editorializing. The legal standard she was meeting was evidentiary, not emotional, and she understood that, and she gave them what the standard required. Maddox's attorney tried twice to characterize her extraction decision as insubordination. She answered both challenges the same way, without elevation in her voice. She had assessed the tactical situation in real time with the information available to her and made the call that preserved the maximum number of operational assets, including the primary intelligence objective. She would make the same call again. The second time she said it, she looked directly at Maddox. He looked away. Marcus Tell testified after her. He walked to the chair with the cane and the compensated gait and the jaw scar, and he testified for an hour, and she sat in the gallery and listened to his voice, which she'd heard 4 years ago every day and then not at all, and now here, in a federal hearing room in Atlanta, telling the truth about a night that had almost killed them both. And she kept her face steady and her hands still in her lap and let it be exactly what it was. Dana Fisk appeared by video from Seattle, which the panel had accommodated. She was compact and direct and looked at the camera with the specific expression of someone who had been waiting a long time to say what they were about to say and was not going to waste the opportunity. Her testimony covered the period of suppression, the conditions of her own KIA designation, and a specific conversation she'd had with Maddox in the week following the extraction that the investigators had already flagged, and that now, with Fisk's direct account, became the clearest piece of evidence in the record. Maddox had known. He had known they were alive. He had made the decision that they should not be. The hearing panel recessed twice. Maddox's attorney filed 2 procedural objections that were both denied. The document restriction motion was addressed and denied in the first recess, which meant the full correspondence, including the decoded message to Whitmore, including the file on Evelyn that had been staged for submission to the nursing board, was entered into the record. When the panel returned from the second recess, the senior officer at the center of the table, a 2-star named General Voss, who had the economical manner of someone who measured words by their necessity, looked at the room and spoke for 4 minutes. The charges against Colonel Raymond Maddox were confirmed: falsification of military records, abuse of command authority, conduct unbecoming, and 3 additional counts that Voss read with the flat precision of someone reading a bill of materials. Maddox would face a general court-martial. His retirement status was suspended pending the outcome. The rank was subject to reduction. His attorney was already writing when Voss finished speaking. Maddox looked at the panel, then, once, briefly, at Evelyn. And she looked back, and whatever he was looking for in her face, he didn't find it because she wasn't giving him anything. Not contempt, not satisfaction, not forgiveness. She was looking at him the way you look at a fact, plainly, without embellishment. He looked away again. The session was concluded. In the corridor outside, Marcus Tell found her. I was better on the cane than he'd been in the parking lot 3 weeks ago. She'd spent time with him in the days since, careful and gradual, 2 people rebuilding a map of each other across 4 years of absence. And he stopped beside her and said nothing for a moment, and she said nothing for a moment, and the corridor moved around them with the foot traffic of a federal building on a Tuesday. "How do you feel?" he asked. She considered the question seriously. "Like something heavy has been set down somewhere, and I'm still figuring out what to do with my hands now that I'm not carrying it." He looked at her. "That's a good problem." "Yeah," she said. "It is." Dana Fisk appeared from the far end of the corridor, moving fast in the direct way she'd always moved, and she covered the distance between them in about 6 seconds, and stopped and looked at Evelyn and said nothing for a half-beat, and then said, "You look terrible." "I've been told I need more sleep." "You've needed more sleep since 2019. Fisk looked at her with the expression she'd always had, pragmatic, warm underneath the practicality, the particular affection of people who've been through something together that can't be explained to anyone who wasn't there. "Come have lunch, both of you. We have things to talk about that aren't this building." They went to lunch. The things that happened after the hearing happened in the way that real institutional consequences happen. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with the grinding forward momentum of processes set in motion and running now to their conclusions. Gerald Whitmore was charged with obstruction and criminal facilitation. His cooperation with the DoD investigators, which had begun within hours of his removal from the hospital, extensive and detailed in the way of someone trying to negotiate terms, reduced the exposure but didn't eliminate it. He entered a plea agreement 6 weeks after the hearing. He would not be returning to hospital administration. Victor Sloan appeared before the State Medical Board in a proceeding that lasted 2 days. His self-reported review, combined with the documentation Evelyn had accumulated over 3 years, the 8 clinical disagreements, the 6 cases where intervention had been delayed, the pattern of dismissing nursing assessments across the department, constituted a record that the board found significant. He received a formal censure and a mandatory practice monitoring period of 18 months. He was not stripped of his license. The chief of staff appointment was permanently withdrawn. He remained at Riverside Crest as an attending under supervision in a department that now understood that his assessments were one input and not the final word. She didn't feel triumphant about any of it. She'd been asked by a reporter who'd gotten wind of the story through the public JAG filing whether she felt justice had been served. She'd looked at the reporter, young, earnest, operating on a framework that expected her to say yes or no, and said, "I feel like the record is accurate now. That matters more to me than how it feels." The reporter had printed a version of that which wasn't quite what she'd said, which was fine. That was how things got translated in the space between what a person means and what a sentence can carry. At Riverside Crest, things changed in the specific way of institutions that have been disrupted and are attempting to restabilize. The nursing staff received a formal apology from the interim administrator, a woman named Dr. Patricia Osei, who had come in from the district office and who had the brisk, fair quality of someone who understood that the first order of business was not optics, but function. The apology was specific, not generic. It addressed the systematic undervaluation of nursing assessments in clinical decision-making, the failure to investigate documented concerns, and the personnel environment that had allowed a pattern of intimidation to persist in the trauma department. Dolores had been in the room when the apology was delivered, and later in the break room she'd told Evelyn that she'd been waiting 9 years to hear something like it, and that it had taken everything she had not to stand up during the reading and say several specific things. "You should have," Evelyn said. "Oh, I said them afterward," Dolores said. "To Osei directly." She took notes. Patel was formally listed as primary physician on the Okafor case. His surgical evaluation forms were updated to reflect his actual role. He found out on a Thursday morning when his attending supervisor mentioned it in passing, and he came to find Evelyn at the nursing station with the expression of someone who didn't know how to absorb something good without checking it for a catch. "It's accurate," she told him before he could ask. He nodded, stood there for a moment. "Did I ask you something?" "Sure." "That night, did you know Okafor was going to make it?" She thought about it honestly. "I knew Okafor had a chance if we moved fast enough and made the right calls. That's all I ever know." She looked at him. "That's all anyone ever knows. The rest is the work." He went back to his rounds. She watched him go and thought that he was going to be a good physician, was already a good physician, and that the difference between good and exceptional was often just whether someone had been given room to be either. The program launched 6 weeks after the hearing. It didn't have a grand name. Osei had suggested calling it the Riverside Crest Integrated Trauma Response Initiative, which was accurate and also entirely unmemorable. And Evelyn had said so directly, and Osei had laughed and said, "What would you call it?" And Evelyn had said, "Call it the cross-training program because that's what it is." And Osei had said done, and that was what it was called. The premise was straightforward. Military-trained medical personnel and civilian hospital staff would cross-train together, with structured curriculum covering combat trauma management, triage under resource constraints, and the command protocols used in military medical units that had been proven to reduce decision-making delays in high-pressure situations. The curriculum ran 2 days a month. Attendance was mandatory for all trauma nurses and residents and voluntary for attending physicians. And in the first session, 11 of the 14 attendings came, which Evelyn took as data. She ran the sessions herself, with Carver's help on the tactical medicine components and Patel's help on the resident-facing curriculum. Morales, the orthopedic resident who'd taken the fasciotomy case on his own initiative, became a regular presence and turned out to have a quality for teaching that he hadn't previously had a venue for. In the third session, Sloan showed up. He sat at the back, didn't volunteer answers, took notes on paper rather than a tablet, which was either an analog preference or a decision to be less visible about what he was writing, and she didn't know which, and it wasn't her business to know. At the end of the session, when she was packing up the materials, he stopped at the front of the room. "That airway management sequence you walked through," he said. "The modified RSI protocol for field conditions. Where did you learn that version?" "A corpsman in a forward surgical team in a place I can't name in a year I'd rather not specify. He adapted it for limited drug availability." She looked at Sloan. "It works." He nodded slowly. "I've been doing RSI one way for 20 years. There are better ways. That's the point of the program." He looked at the room, the chairs, the whiteboard, the printed materials. "I know," he said. "I know that's the point." He picked up one of the handouts. "I'm going to try the modified sequencing next week, in the sim lab, before I use it on a patient." "Good," she said. "That's the right order." He left. She didn't know what to do with Victor Sloan. She suspected she'd never fully know what to do with him, which was probably an accurate reflection of who he was. Not a villain in the clean narrative sense, but a man who had accumulated enough institutional authority to stop being corrected and had then spent years operating in the resulting blind spot. The monitoring period would pressure test whether he was capable of functioning differently. She'd find out the same way she found out about everyone, by watching what he did when it cost something. It was not her job to rehabilitate him. It was her job to run a program that made the building safer, which included making it safer from the effects of people like him. And she was doing that, and that was enough. Sergeant Dolan came back to Riverside Crest 7 weeks after the night of the storm. He walked in through the main entrance, not the ambulance bay, the main entrance, the one with the lobby and the volunteer at the information desk, with a woman who was presumably his wife and 2 children who were presumably his kids, and the slightly unsteady gait of someone whose body was recovering faster than his doctors had projected. He asked at the information desk for Evelyn Brooks. The volunteer called down to the ER. Evelyn came up to the lobby. He was taller than she remembered, which happened sometimes when you first met someone horizontal and then saw them vertical. He looked at her across the lobby, and his expression had none of the sedated blankness of the man on the litter. He looked like someone's father, like someone's husband, like someone who had been somewhere very close to a different outcome and was living in the permanent awareness of that, which wasn't a comfortable way to live, but was an honest one. He crossed the lobby and extended his hand. She shook it. "My wife wanted to come," he said. "She had some things she wanted to say." The woman beside him had the expression of someone who had prepared remarks and was reconfiguring them in real time because the moment was different than the preparation. She looked at Evelyn and seemed to decide that the preparation was insufficient and said simply, "Thank you. I know that's not enough." "It's enough," Evelyn said, because it was. The children were 7 and 9, she estimated. They looked at her with the unfiltered assessment of children, trying to understand what kind of person this was. The older one, a girl, said, "Are you a soldier?" "I was," Evelyn said. "Are you a nurse now?" "Yes." The girl considered this with the serious deliberation of someone for whom the 2 facts didn't yet connect into a coherent picture. "Can you be both?" "Turns out yes," Evelyn said. They stayed for 20 minutes. Dolan wanted to see the bay where he'd been treated. She walked him back, he looked at the space, said nothing in particular, and didn't need to. His wife held his hand while he looked. The children touched the equipment with the cautious curiosity of children who've been told not to touch things, and are doing so anyway because the adult supervision is distracted. When they left, Evelyn stood in Bay 1 for a moment after. The room was occupied now. A different patient, an elderly man with a hip fracture waiting for surgical clearance, a family member in the chair beside him, scrolling a phone. The ordinary work. The relentless, necessary, unspecial ordinary work that the building produced every hour of every day, regardless of what had happened in this room on any given night. She checked the man's chart out of habit. His pain management was adequate. His surgical slot was confirmed for tomorrow morning. She went back to the floor. Marcus Tell drove down from Virginia on a Friday in November, 3 months after the hearing. The cane was gone. He'd been discharged from physical therapy with a clean prognosis and a left leg that worked correctly, as long as he didn't ask it to do things it had specifically been told not to do yet, which he had so far managed to comply with because his PT had been extremely clear about the consequences, and Marcus was, underneath everything, someone who respected clear information. They walked along the waterfront in the evening, which was cool now and less humid than it would be in 8 months. The river dark and moving slowly, the lights of the bridges reflected in it. They'd been talking for 3 months across state lines, carefully, then less carefully, then with the ease of people who are remembering something they'd never formally defined but had both known the shape of. "Fisk wants to come visit," he said. "She's been emailing me about it 3 times last week. Tell her the guest room is available." He looked at her. "You have a guest room?" "I have a room with a bed in it that I don't currently use for anything else." She paused. "Close enough." He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh, genuinely, uncomplicated, since before all of it, and it landed in her chest in a way she didn't try to categorize. "I got an offer," he said after a moment. "From who?" "Hargrove's office, a training position, working with medical teams preparing for forward surgical operations, curriculum development, instructional role." He looked at the river. "Not field, not active deployment, but not a desk either. Are you going to take it?" "I think so." He paused. "You?" "There are conversations happening," she said, "about expanding the program, taking it beyond Riverside Crest, regional hospitals, civilian trauma centers, curriculum sharing. She looked at the bridge lights on the water. Hargrove's name is on some of those conversations too. She has a long reach. She does. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. I'm not leaving the hospital, whatever else happens. The program lives there, the staff is there. Barton and Dolores and Patel. She thought about the cross-training program and the way Morales had looked when a third-year resident from an outside program had come in for a session last month and had asked him afterward how he'd learned to teach. That's mine, I built it. Yeah, Marcus said. You did. They walked for a while without talking, and the river moved and the city made its sounds, and she thought about a parking lot in the rain and 2 helicopters, and a man who'd grabbed the nearest person by the collar and asked where Phantom was, and the answer had been right there, had been there for 3 years, in a pair of waterlogged sneakers and a medication dispensary and a half-eaten granola bar and 8 documented clinical disagreements that nobody had bothered to ask about. She'd been there the whole time. She'd always been there. The memorial was in December. It wasn't official. Nobody had organized it through a command structure or submitted a request through channels. Carver had sent a message to the people who needed to know, and they'd come because they wanted to, which was the only reason a memorial should happen. It was at a small park outside Savannah, near a tree line, which had no particular significance except that Carver had grown up in this city and knew a place that was quiet in the morning. A handful of operators. Ralston. Alderton, who stood slightly apart with the expression of someone who understood they were present as a witness, not a participant. Dana Fisk, who had flown in from Seattle. Marcus Tell. The names of the team members who had actually died. Not Evelyn, not Tell, not Fisk, but the others, the real ones, the 2 who hadn't made it out of the secondary exfil point and whose deaths had been accurate in the report even when everything else was a lie, were spoken aloud. Just the names. No performance around them. Evelyn said her teammate's name into the cold December air of a park outside Savannah, and the sound of it moved out into the morning and didn't come back, which was the nature of names said aloud to no one in particular. She'd been carrying his name for 4 years. It felt different to say it out loud, heavier and lighter at the same time, in the way that true things feel when they're finally given the room they've needed. Carver said something afterward. Brief. About the specific way these people had lived. Not the dying, which got too much attention in retrospect, but the living. And about the particular quality of people who ran toward things when everyone else's instinct was the other direction. She thought he was talking about the team. She suspected he was also talking about her. She didn't correct him either way. There are things nobody tells you about being underestimated for a long time. They tell you it's unfair, which it is. They tell you to prove yourself, which is advice that assumes the people who need convincing are capable of being convinced, and they often aren't, not by the kind of evidence you can produce on their terms, in their rooms, with their definitions of what counts as proof. What they don't tell you is that the underestimation doesn't touch the thing underneath. The work is still the work. The hands that place a needle in the right location are doing that regardless of whether the person watching understands what they're seeing. The decision made at 2 a.m. in a parking lot in the rain, the right decision, the one that saves the lives that get saved. That decision is made by what you've built in yourself over years, and what you've built doesn't require an audience. Evelyn had spent 3 years being told what she was, which was a smaller and simpler thing than what she actually was. She'd let them believe it because she needed the ground beneath her feet and the work in her hands and the space to exist without explaining herself. She hadn't waited for rescue. She hadn't planned for revelation. She'd done her job, day after day, with the consistent excellence of someone who understands that the work is the point and the recognition is a secondary event that may or may not arrive on a schedule that makes sense. It had arrived in a storm, in a parking lot, in the form of 2 helicopters and a dying sergeant and a call sign she'd almost forgotten anyone remembered. It doesn't always arrive that way. Sometimes it doesn't arrive at all. Sometimes the person who has been holding things together invisibly for years remains invisible. And the injustice of that is real, and it matters, and it should be named. But the thing underneath the injustice, the thing that does the work, the thing that makes the call, the thing that walks through the doors into the rain when everything would be easier if you just went back to the nursing station, that thing doesn't need to be recognized to be real. It was always real. That's the part they can't take from you, the part that was never theirs to give. On the first Thursday of the new year, Evelyn Brooks walked into Riverside Crest Medical Center at 6:45 in the morning. Her sneakers were dry. The ceiling tile near the ambulance bay had been repaired. The waiting room had 6 people in it, and the overnight board had 4 cases, and Dolores was at the station in the process of handing off to the day charge nurse and looked up when Evelyn came through and said simply, "Bay 2 wants a second look at the pain management protocol." "I'll get it," Evelyn said. She put her bag in her locker. She pulled on her gloves. She picked up the chart for Bay 2 and read it on her way down the corridor, and the building moved around her the way buildings move around people who belong in them. And outside the windows, the January morning was cold and clear and arriving, and she went to work.